How camels was used in World War I and World War II. Throughout history, few animals have shaped the movement and endurance of armies in harsh environments more than the camel. Across centuries of human conflict, these resilient creatures served as silent partners to soldiers, explorers, and traders alike. But during the two great global conflicts of the 20th century, World War I and World War II, the camel's role reached a new level of strategic importance. As mechanized warfare advanced, the camel stood at the crossroads between the age of traditional logistics and the dawn of modern military transport. The story of the camel in the First and Second World Wars is one of adaptation, endurance, and gradual obsolescence. It is a story that spans continents, from the burning sands of North Africa to the rocky plains of the Middle East, and even into the steppes of Central Asia. It is a reminder that while tanks and airplanes dominated headlines, wars are won and lost, as much by supply and endurance as by the weapons that define them. The camel, an ancient ally. Long before the world was drawn into industrialized conflict, camels had been a cornerstone of desert warfare and commerce. Their unique physiology, able to survive days without water, carry loads up to 600 pounds, and traverse vast stretches of desert without rest, made them indispensable in the regions stretching from North Africa to the Arabian Peninsula and deep into Central Asia. There are two main species of camel: the single-humped dromedary, native to the hot deserts of Arabia and North Africa, and the double-humped Bactrian camel, suited for the colder steppes and mountain fringes of Central Asia. Each served the needs of its region's armies, from ancient Persian and Arab campaigns to 19th century British and French colonial expeditions. When World War I erupted in 1914, many military planners still viewed the camel as an essential component of warfare in the East. In deserts where motor vehicles quickly failed and horses perished under heat and thirst, the camel remained unmatched. As European empires expanded their theatres of war into Africa and the Middle East, the animal once used by traders and nomads was re-enlisted to serve the modern war machine. Camels in World War I. The desert becomes a battlefield. The First World War was largely remembered for its trenches, tanks, and artillery, but beyond Europe, it unfolded in vast open spaces where old modes of warfare persisted. The deserts of the Middle East in particular became a stage for campaigns where mobility was everything and the camel became indispensable. In the Sinai and Palestine campaigns, where British and Ottoman forces clashed for control of the Suez Canal, and the Eastern Mediterranean camels carried supplies, troops, and communication equipment through areas inaccessible to vehicles. The British established several camel-mounted units, the most famous of which was the Imperial Camel Corps, created in 1916. The corps included soldiers from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and India, and at its height numbered nearly 4,000 men with more than 12,000 camels. Its mission was to patrol, scout, and strike deep into enemy territory across the harsh deserts of Sinai and Arabia. These troops fought in some of the most inhospitable terrain of the war, conducting long-range raids and reconnaissance missions where endurance meant survival. Camels proved invaluable not only as mounts, but also as supply carriers. Their ability to travel long distances without water, up to 50 miles a day for several days, allowed armies to maintain supply lines that would otherwise collapse. In the Arabian desert, where T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, led guerrilla operations against Ottoman forces, camels were the backbone of his irregular army. Lawrence's Bedouin allies relied on camels not only for transport, but also for food and shelter, using their milk and hides to sustain life in regions where supply convoys could not reach. Camels carried weapons, ammunition, and even small field guns across dunes and rocky escarpments, giving mobility to a force that would help shape the future of the Middle East. In Africa, the story was similar. The British and French colonial armies employed camel units in campaigns against German colonies in East and West Africa. The British organised Bikaner Camel Corps from India fought in Egypt and Sudan, while French forces used camels in North Africa to patrol borders and deliver mail intelligence and medical supplies. However, the camel's utility had its limits. While camels could thrive in deserts, they were vulnerable to modern weapons. Machine gun fire and artillery took a heavy toll. They were also difficult to manage under bombardment. The loud noises and explosions often caused panic in camel trains. Despite these challenges, their contribution was indispensable to campaigns in remote regions where fuel and roadways were scarce. By the end of World War I, the camel had proven its worth as both a logistical and combat resource. But as the war demonstrated the growing dominance of motorized transport, its military future was already under question. Between wars, the transition to mechanization. The years between the two world wars marked a transition period for global military logistics. The camel, once seen as a symbol of endurance and empire, faced gradual replacement by trucks, trains, and aircraft. Yet, in many parts of the world, especially in colonial territories where infrastructure was poor, the camel remained the only practical option. In the British Empire's African and Middle Eastern territories, small camel corps units continued to patrol vast desert frontiers. In Sudan, the Sudan Camel Corps served as a colonial policing force. They were tasked with guarding borders, controlling smuggling routes, and maintaining order in remote regions. Similarly, in India's northwestern frontier, camels continued to support the British Indian Army in reconnaissance and supply missions across the deserts of Baluchistan and Rajasthan. By the late 1930s, the appearance of armoured cars and all-terrain vehicles had diminished the camel's strategic importance. Still, few commanders were willing to completely abandon them. The coming of the Second World War would soon prove that even in the age of tanks and aircraft, the camel's endurance and adaptability still had a role to play. Camels in World War II endurance, amid mechanization. When World War II erupted in 1939, many assumed that animals of burden had become relics of the past. Yet, as the conflict expanded across global terrains from the frozen steppes of Russia to the deserts of North Africa, it became clear that not every battlefield could be conquered by engines. In the Middle East and North Africa, the British, Italian, and German armies faced the same timeless challenge: how to move men and materiel through vast deserts with limited water and fuel. Mechanized columns often bogged down in sand or broke under extreme heat. Fuel shortages were constant, and so once again the camel returned to the war effort. The British Army revived the use of camel-mounted patrols in the Western Desert Campaign against Axis forces. The long-range desert group, famous for its deep penetration raids, sometimes relied on camel caravans for supply in areas too remote for vehicles to traverse. In Egypt and Sudan, Camel Corps units were deployed for reconnaissance and transport, particularly in regions near the Red Sea and the Ethiopian highlands. The Free French Camel Corps, operating under General Charles de Gaulle's command, fought alongside British forces in East Africa and Chad. Their camels carried supplies, communication gear, and ammunition across areas devoid of roads or depots. These were not large-scale operations, but they demonstrated how the camel remained an irreplaceable tool in specific environments. In the Soviet Union, Bactrian camels played an unexpected role. During the early stages of the war, when the German invasion of the Soviet Union caused immense logistical strain, the Red Army pressed camels into service, particularly in Central Asia and the southern steppes. Their fuel and spare parts for vehicles were in short supply, and the rugged terrain made transportation difficult. Camels were used to haul artillery pieces, supplies, and wounded soldiers across mud, snow, and broken ground. One of the most enduring symbols of this unlikely service was Kuznechik, a Bactrian camel adopted by the Soviet 308th Rifle Division, which later became the 120th Guards Rifle Division. Kuznechik marched with Soviet troops from the Volga to Berlin, carrying supplies and ammunition through some of the war's harshest conditions. When the division entered Berlin in 1945, Kuznechik was still with them, a living symbol of endurance and the unlikely bond between man and beast in the most mechanized war in history. In the Middle East, The Arab Legion, a force raised under British supervision in Transjordan, continued to use camels for desert patrols and intelligence gathering. Their ability to traverse hundreds of miles with minimal water made them ideal for policing the vast open landscapes between British positions. Camels also carried communication lines, medical equipment and rations through areas where wheeled transport was still unreliable. Italian forces in Libya and Ethiopia also used camels particularly for logistical support in desert and mountain operations. The East African Campaign 1940 to 1941 saw both Allied and Axis forces utilizing local camel herds to move food, water and ammunition. The mountainous and arid terrain made them a necessity, especially when fuel and vehicles were unavailable or destroyed. The limitations of camel warfare. While camels proved their endurance yet again, World War II also revealed their limitations more starkly than ever before. Mechanized forces could move faster, carry more, and operate independently of the natural pace required by animals. Camels were also vulnerable to air attacks and strafing, which became a dominant feature of modern warfare. Furthermore, maintaining camels required a specialized corps of handlers and knowledge that few modern armies possessed. Training, feeding, and veterinary care for camel units demanded resources that were increasingly scarce. For example, in the British Army, the use of camels declined rapidly after 1942, as trucks and aircraft became more available in the North African Campaign. By 1943, as the Allies pushed Axis forces from Africa and mechanized logistics became the norm, camels largely disappeared from active battlefronts. Yet, in the remote fringes of empire, they continued to serve quietly until the end of the war, patrolling, carrying supplies, and serving as living relics of an earlier era. The decline and legacy of the Camel Corps. By the end of the Second World War, the camel's military career was nearing its close. Technological progress had overtaken the animal's traditional role. The development of four-wheel drive vehicles, aircraft transport, and improved fuel logistics rendered the camel obsolete as a tool of war. Yet its legacy endured. In Sudan, the Camel Corps remained active until the 1950s, functioning as a desert police unit. In India and Pakistan, camel units were retained for border patrols where the terrain still favored their use. In some areas, such as the Thar Desert and parts of Oman, camels continued to assist with military logistics well into the late 20th century. More than just transport animals, camels represented an era when war was not only about machines, but also about adaptation to environment and endurance under hardship. They bridged the ancient and the modern, the line between caravan and convoy, between empire and industry. In both world wars, camels stood as silent witnesses to a changing age. They carried men and supplies across deserts and steppes, bridging distances that no vehicle could yet conquer. They served in the Imperial Camel Corps in Sinai, alongside Lawrence in Arabia, with the Soviet divisions near Stalingrad, and with French and British patrols across Africa. They symbolized endurance, adaptation, and the last chapter of an ancient military partnership. When the guns fell silent in 1945, so too did much of the camel's service to war. But in their quiet withdrawal from the stage of modern conflict lies a profound lesson that even as technology transforms warfare, the natural world and its creatures have always been indispensable to human survival. The story of the camel in the world wars is not one of glory or conquest, but of endurance and necessity. A reminder that the most enduring allies of humanity are often those that cannot speak but carry our burdens through history nonetheless. Part 2. Elephants in World War I and World War II. Elephants had been domesticated for labour for thousands of years across South and Southeast Asia. By the 19th century, both the British and French colonial administrations in Asia depended on elephants for logging transportation and heavy construction. In the dense jungles of Burma, Siam and Ceylon, today's Myanmar, Thailand and Sri Lanka, elephants served as the backbone of the timber industry. Their strength allowed them to haul enormous teak logs through terrain where no wagon could pass. They were trained to push, drag and stack wood with remarkable precision, guided by their human handlers, known as mahouts. When industrialized warfare came to Asia during the 20th century, these same elephants and their mahouts were drawn into the orbit of global conflict. They were no longer symbols of ancient power, but essential laborers pressed into service for a modern cause. Elephants in World War I, Empire's heavy lifters. World War I, though remembered primarily for the battlefields of Europe, touched nearly every corner of the globe. In Asia, Africa and the Pacific colonial territories became part of a worldwide network of production, supply and construction. In British-controlled Burma and India, elephants were used extensively in war-related industries. The extraction of timber, the building of bridges, and the construction of supply depots all depended on them. The British War Office requisitioned elephants from forestry companies to meet wartime demands for hardwood, essential for railways, trenches and shipbuilding. Records from the period show that elephants worked tirelessly to haul timber and clear land for military use. Their tasks included dragging telegraph poles, loading ammunition, and assisting engineers in road and railway construction. In Malaya and Burma, they were also used to transport goods through dense forests where motorized vehicles were still impractical. In Africa, particularly in German, East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, elephants were part of the logistical landscape. Though not directly enlisted, wild elephant herds were often encountered and sometimes exploited by both German and Allied forces for ivory or for clearing jungle routes. However, domesticated elephant labor was primarily an Asian phenomenon during the Great War. The war's industrial scale gradually eclipsed animal labor elsewhere, but in Asia, where terrain and climate defied mechanization, elephants remained crucial. When the war ended in 1918, they quietly returned to their peacetime work in the forests, unaware that a larger conflict awaited only a generation away. Elephants in World War II. Laborers of the jungle. When World War II began in 1939, the elephants of Asia once again found themselves drawn into a human struggle they could not comprehend. Across the jungles of Burma, Malaya and India, elephants became vital assets for both Allied and Axis powers. The jungles of Southeast Asia were dense, humid, and largely inaccessible to vehicles. Roads were few, rivers unpredictable, and the monsoon season could turn the ground into deep mud. Under such conditions, even the most advanced mechanized armies struggled. It was here that elephants, strong, intelligent, and sure-footed, became irreplaceable. The British, Japanese, and later American forces all used elephants for construction and transport. They dragged heavy logs to build bridges, hauled supplies through jungles, cleared roads, and sometimes carried wounded soldiers out of battle zones. The elephants' work was grueling. In monsoon rains, they moved through rivers swollen with silt and debris. In blistering heat, they pulled supply wagons along paths barely wide enough for their massive bodies. Their endurance, guided by the experience of their mahouts, helped sustain the Allied supply effort through the most remote parts of Southeast Asia. The Elephant Company and Billy Williams. Among the most remarkable stories from this period is that of James Howard Williams, a British forester known as Elephant Bill. Williams had lived in Burma since the 1920s, working for the Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation, one of the major teak companies. He knew the forest, the terrain, and most importantly, the elephants better than most men alive. When the Japanese invaded Burma in 1942, the country's infrastructure began to collapse. Bridges were destroyed, roads flooded, and thousands of civilians fled westward toward India. Williams, understanding both the elephants and the geography, was asked to use his experience to help with evacuations and construction efforts. Williams commanded what became known as the Elephant Company. His team consisted of more than 100 trained elephants and their mahouts working in the dense jungle between Burma and India. The company's tasks were as varied as they were vital, constructing bridges across ravines, dragging supply trucks out of mud, and rescuing refugees stranded in the wilderness. Their most famous achievement came during the Allied retreat from Burma. As Japanese forces advanced, Williams and his team led a column of refugee soldiers and elephants through the jungle toward the safety of India. At one point, they encountered an 80-meter sandstone cliff blocking their route. With no alternative path, Williams ordered his men to carve steps directly into the cliff face, large enough for elephants to climb. It took days of effort, but one by one the elephants ascended the man-made staircase, hauling people and supplies with them. When they reached the top, the column continued onto India alive because of the animals' strength and discipline. For Williams, the elephants were not mere labourers, but intelligent partners. He noted their capacity for memory, empathy, and cooperation qualities that defied many Western assumptions about animal intelligence. His wartime service earned him distinction, and after the war, he devoted his life to elephant conservation and humane training. His experiences were later detailed in books and documentaries, earning him the enduring title, Elephant Bill. Other notable wartime elephant operations. The use of elephants was not confined to the British Empire. The Japanese also employed them after capturing parts of Southeast Asia. In Burma, Malaya and Thailand, captured elephants and mahouts were conscripted into Japanese service. They built roads, airstrips and bridges to support Japanese military operations across the region. Both sides in the Burma campaign relied heavily on elephant labour, especially in areas near the Irrawaddy and Chindwin rivers. When British and Indian forces began their counter-offensive in 1944, elephants once again played a key logistical role. They moved supplies for units operating far from established roads and helped construct temporary bridges for advancing troops. Another remarkable episode came from the efforts of Giles Mackerel, a British tea planter in Assam, India. In 1942, when hundreds of refugees fleeing Burma were stranded by monsoon floods, Mackerel organised an elephant rescue team. Using elephants from local plantations, he led them across flooded rivers and dense jungle to reach the stranded civilians. Over several weeks, his team rescued more than 200 people. The operation was recognised by the British government and remains one of the most extraordinary humanitarian missions of the war. Elephants were also used for reconstruction work, far from the battlefield. In Europe, 2 elephants from German zoos known as Mary and Kiri were deployed in post-bombing cleanup efforts during the final years of the war. They hauled debris, moved rubble, and cleared damaged streets after Allied air raids. Though their presence in Europe was rare, it illustrated the global scale of animal labour even in the most industrialised nations. Elephants and the human connection. Unlike camels, which were used primarily as beasts of burden, elephants developed more complex working relationships with humans. The mahout system, based on trust training and lifelong partnership, was central to their effectiveness. A mahout usually worked with a single elephant for many years, sometimes for life. During the war, this bond was crucial. Orders were often relayed through the mahout, who would communicate through voice, touch and gesture. Elephants responded to tone and familiarity. They could recognize dozens of commands and distinguish between friendly and hostile voices. Reports from both Allied and Japanese records describe elephants displaying remarkable problem-solving behavior, such as clearing obstacles without instruction or adjusting their movement to avoid danger. Their intelligence and reliability made them indispensable in regions where no machine could yet replace them. However, the demands of war also inflicted suffering. Elephants faced exhaustion, malnutrition and disease. Bombings and shellfire terrified them, and many died from overwork or injuries sustained in construction zones. Veterinary care was limited, and replacement animals were difficult to obtain. For many mahouts, the loss of an elephant was a personal tragedy. Still, their contribution remained largely unheralded. Official war histories mentioned elephants only briefly, often as footnotes to larger operations. Yet without them, the supply networks of Burma, India, and Malaya might have collapsed entirely. After the war, reconstruction and legacy. When World War II ended in 1945, elephants continued to serve in reconstruction across Asia. The devastation of bridges, railways, and roads required massive rebuilding, and elephants once again became indispensable laborers. In Burma, they helped rebuild logging operations destroyed during the conflict. In Thailand and India, they worked on clearing war debris and re-establishing transport routes. For many years after the war, elephants remained the backbone of Southeast Asia's forestry industry, a living reminder of their wartime contributions. The post-war years also saw renewed attention to elephant welfare. The experiences of men like Billy Williams helped foster modern conservation ethics. He advocated for humane treatment, understanding of elephant psychology, and the protection of wild herds from overexploitation. In time, mechanization reached even the remotest forests and the role of elephants declined. Trucks and bulldozers replaced them in logging. Helicopters and cranes replaced them in construction. Yet in some parts of Myanmar and India, elephants continue to be used in limited forestry and tourism operations, a vestige of their once vast service to empire and war. Comparison between wars. Comparing their roles in World War I and World War II reveals a striking continuity. In both conflicts, elephants were not combatants but essential laborers. The difference lay in scale and visibility. In World War I, elephants primarily supported the infrastructure of empire, helping extract resources and maintain colonial industries that supplied the front lines elsewhere. Their service was indirect, but vital to sustaining Britain's global war effort. In World War II, elephants operated closer to the fighting, especially in Burma and Malaya. Their work became a matter of immediate military necessity, bridging the gap between industrial warfare and jungle survival. They carried weapons, food, and medical supplies to frontline troops and evacuated wounded men from battle zones. Thus, across both wars, elephants symbolized an enduring truth in regions where geography defeated machines. Living power, guided by experience and partnership, remained indispensable. End of an era. By the late 1940s, as new technologies spread across Asia, the era of the working war elephant drew to a close. Diesel trucks, tracked vehicles, and aerial transport eliminated the need for animal power. But even as elephants faded from military use, their legend endured. In the decades that followed, memoirs, films, and documentaries revived their stories. Williams' accounts became the basis for studies on animal intelligence and cooperation. In military archives, the records of the Burma campaigns testify to how heavily armies depended on elephants for engineering feats that machines could not yet achieve. Today, historians regard the elephant's role in both world wars as one of the last major examples of large-scale animal labor in human conflict. Their participation bridges the gap between ancient warfare, when elephants carried warriors into battle, and modern logistics, where they built the very foundations upon which mechanized armies moved. In the sweeping history of the world wars, the story of elephants stands apart. They were not symbols of destruction, but of endurance and adaptation. Where tanks stalled and vehicles failed, elephants advanced steadily, dragging, lifting, and carrying the burdens of war. Their contribution was not measured in battles won or lost, but in bridges built, refugees saved, and roads cleared. In the jungles of Burma and India, their footprints mark a quiet but vital chapter in the history of global conflict. When the guns finally fell silent, the elephants returned to the forests. Some went back to logging, others to conservation camps, and many to lives that seemed far removed from the violence they had endured. Yet the memory of their service remained among those who worked beside them, men like Billy Williams, who understood that strength without cruelty and intelligence without arrogance could still move mountains even in the age of machines. In both world wars, elephants stood as living reminders that progress does not always mean replacement. Sometimes survival depends on adapting the oldest partnerships known to humankind. And so, as the 20th century advanced into the atomic age, the elephant quietly withdrew from the front lines of human conflict, leaving behind a legacy of labor loyalty and resilience that remains unmatched in the annals of war.